Today we look at regions in the United States that are dead or dying here at the end of 2023. The United States has many regions, some official, some not. In this video, I'm creating my own regions of dead zones. Dead zones are areas in the United States that have no major industries or people, or they're currently losing people and jobs at a rate that can only be described as alarming. These places aren't always bad. Sometimes they're just so remote, people and employers never consider them as an option. And unless you're a special breed of humanoid, you shouldn't either. And no, I'm not wrong about employers because your local bait shop can't find someone to cover Larry's Sunday morning shift when his gout is acting up. Doesn't count. All right, we're looking at America's greatest dead zones. Get it? Got it? Good. Let's take a look. Alaskan cities. Alaska has never been a populous state. It's one of the most beautiful places on Earth, and not just here in the United States. It's got a history that is colorful and interesting, both good and bad. The downside is its remoteness. It is disconnected from the rest of the United States. This might not be a bad thing to some, but to most, it's a major drag. That means there's a lot of problems living here. Flights are all-day affairs, if not longer. Everything at the freaking store past salmon is about 20% higher because of shipping. Teeth are optional, and it's a little bit wild, which presents its own challenges to city folks in or outside the few cities Alaska has. Alaskan cities aren't that big. Other than Anchorage, the rest are like glorified towns or truck stops. A little more brief history and then I'll tell you why it's a dead zone. Alaska is one of our youngest states, becoming a state in 1959. The Alaska Purchase saw the Russian Empire transfer Alaska to the United States for the grand sum of $7.2 million in 1867. That's right, we bought an entire state larger than most countries for what the typical house goes for in Malibu, California. The reality is $7 million then is worth about $150 million now. But homes in Malibu, California go for about $7 million. On May 15th of that year, the United States Senate ratified a bilateral treaty that had been signed on March 30th. The American sovereignty became legally effective across the territory on October 18th of that year. Many thought this was a bad decision and they dubbed it Seward's Folly. That was the Secretary of State at the time, William Seward, who approved the purchase. Although he faced criticism when asked what his greatest achievement was as Secretary of State, his response was the purchase of Alaska. Then he went on to say, but it will take the people a generation to find it out, meaning they wouldn't realize the importance of this state for a very long time, which they eventually did. They had a gold rush and a few other things. Alaska and its cities have grown pretty much every single decade until recently. Cities like Anchorage and Juneau have always grown, Juneau being the capital city. In its history, Juneau's only seen 2 decades where they actually lost a small fraction of their population. At the 2020 census, they had only gained 3.1%. Most experts say that's probably going to be their last decade that they're going to gain population. Since 2020, they've already lost about 2% of the population. Anchorage is about the same thing. In 2020, they lost 0.2%, which isn't much, but since then, 2 years later, the end of 2022, I should say, they'd lost almost 1.5% of their population. That is estimated to grow and grow and grow, like continually. Fairbanks still grew at the 2020 census, but they've only got 32,000 people, and it's Alaska's second largest city. Here's the thing, it's a military town. If for some reason they ever decided to close Fort Wainwright, this would be a ghost town. Past government jobs working for the base, they have some mining and tourism. That's what they rely on. The interest in living in Alaska has started to fade over the last handful of years. And this is going to leave Alaska sort of a dead zone for a long time, and especially the cities, unless the cities have something like Fort Wainwright. The empty West. Between Eugene, Oregon, and San Francisco, you have what some call the empty West. The West Coast has some very populated metro areas like San Diego, Los Angeles, San Francisco Bay Area, and in the north you have the Portland metro area and Seattle metro area. In total, that's around 30 million people. In the empty West, which is about the size of Oregon, has around 1 million residents. This area is also known sometimes as the state of Jefferson. Back around World War II, a bunch of people in the area wanted to form the 51st state and name it after the second president. They even had a flag. It had 2 X's on it because they felt they were double-crossed by the state of Oregon and the state of California. The people in this area have always felt like they were underrepresented in the state and local government, so they wanted to govern themselves. In recent years, a band of jackaloons in Oregon have lumped this area into the greater Idaho movement. If you don't know about that, it's a bunch of people in Oregon, mostly in the rural eastern part of the state, want to break off from the state of Oregon and just join Idaho, like Idaho wants them. Anyway, there's several maps for these people and what they want to do. Some include the Empty West area. I don't know, they get a new map like after every happy hour at Applebee's or something. Now in the Empty West, most of the area is rural or mountainous, with a few medium cities like Redding, Eugene, Medford, Grants Pass, Bend, Eureka, and Crescent City. The rural and mountainous areas are kind of why they have such a small population. Back when this part of the country was being settled, people for the most part stayed out of the more rugged areas like the mountains because of farming. It's really hard to grow wheat on the side of a cliff. So of course this has led to no major industries up there past farming and let's say logging. The lumber industry always did play a big part in this area, but that doesn't employ as many people as it used to, just like farming. So this has kind of handicapped the growth of the cities in this area. Sort of leaves it in a dead region, not because the area is bad, just because nobody lives there and nobody really ever will unless something major happens. I always bring up rare earth elements in situations like this. This is something that they mine here in the United States, but a majority of it comes from China and it's very valuable. It's what we use for semiconductors, digital cameras, smartphones, computer parts, things like that. And it's also big in renewable energy. Now an entire area's population can transform if something like that was discovered. Nothing like that has been discovered in this area, so it's going to stay a dead zone for quite some time. Which, in reality, a lot of the people that live there, they're fine with that. They don't want a bunch of people moving there. I'll reinforce this. I'm not saying this is a bad place to live. There's just nothing there unless you want to live a quiet life. Louisiana and its cities. Now, Louisiana is doing great when it comes to growing these days. They have never had a down census where they actually lost population. And to tell you the truth, they've had very few years where they lost population at all. That all changed around 2021, continued in 2022, and it's estimated by the end of 23, which is in a couple days, takes them a couple months to add it all up, they're supposed to have lost for a third year in a row. That's the state of Louisiana. Their cities are really the dead zones. Every single city, if they haven't lost population for like one of the first times, they've definitely slowed down in the last decade. Why is this? Well, there's a whole bunch of reasons. You know, we go through the basics like poverty and crime. Okay, every state's got them. Louisiana's got a little more than they probably should have. Like if the United States was handing out poverty and crime, Louisiana went back for second helpings. They'd probably go back for thirds, but Chicago and Detroit keep cutting in line ahead of them. New Orleans has been losing population since the 1960s. They did gain in 2020, but they are expected to start dumping population again by the 2030 census. Lafayette has always gained, but in 2020, they really slowed down as employment opportunities shrank and crime rose. They barely grew after growing double digits most census. Baton Rouge gained double digits population in almost every decade since they started counting in 1810. At the 2020 census, Baton Rouge lost population for the first time. It is predicted to be the beginning of a trend for these people. And it's just not crime and poverty in all Louisiana. They've been hit several times by some serious hurricanes. They've got flooding all the time. This has displaced a lot of people over the decades. Obviously, the worst case scenario for this was in 2005 when Hurricane Katrina decided to show up at the front door of New Orleans. That hurricane killed 1,800 people and did roughly 97 to 145 billion. They're not totally sure what the end result was. Now I said 1,800 people. It killed some people in the Caribbean and stuff like that. In the United States, it killed 1,392 people. When you live through something like that, your life changes. And sometimes people change location after something like that. And a lot of people did. How do you think Houston got so popular all of a sudden 20 years ago? Right now, the entire population of Louisiana is about 4.5 million residents. If they lose 10% in a decade, that's a big thing. I honestly think they're going to probably lose closer to 20% in the next decade, unless something major happens. And that's why I see them as a dead zone, a whole state, because most of their small towns are losing people too. Extreme poverty does that, just chases people out like a hurricane does. If you can't survive someplace, you move. And this isn't just with humans. Animals do it too. The Utah-Nevada border. If you go the length of the Utah-Nevada border, other than St. George at the very southern tip of Utah, and if you go almost to the northern tip, well, not really northern, about the middle, but on the border, you have Wendover and West Wendover. And the only reason that's there is so they could put a casino on the border of Utah and people will come. Other than that, they have little tiny places that if you sneeze while driving down the road, you will miss them. There's no farming out here. There in past had been some mining, but not enough to really maintain an entire town, much less a city. If you want to film a movie about life on Mars, this is a perfect place to start. The biggest problem with living out here and why there are no people out in this area is water and the rugged terrain. Again, like we said about other places, if people are moving west, they're not stopping at a place that's hard to farm or hard to live. Now, unlike the empty west, nobody's trying to turn this area into a state. If they did, it could be the state of confusion or despair. This is definitely a dead region of the United States. No industries out here, no water, no people, and for the most part, it looks the same as it did when we had the Louisiana Purchase. The empty north. Up at the Canadian border in Montana, North Dakota, and a little bit of Minnesota, you have the empty north. There's nothing up here. In a lot of the areas, the biggest building anywhere around is the U.S. Customs building for the border crossing. There are little towns up in this border that are so far away from everything, if you're an electric car, you can't get to them without running out of juice. If you ever take the Amtrak train known as the Empire Builder, you'll see what I'm talking about. Once you get past Whitefish, Montana and out of the mountains and onto like East Glacier Park, you'll see how desolate this area is. They do have some feisty teachers up there. Years ago, I did a video and I brought up, some stats about some school district up in Montana near, Cut Bank, Shelby or something like that. And I got a profanity-laced tirade email from some teacher. She sent it from the school's email. When I pointed out moron only has one R, it got worse. The largest city in the empty north is probably Minot. Minot is not that big, and the only reason it's there is because there's an Air Force base. If the Air Force base wasn't there, I'm sure it would be just another small town in North Dakota. This area is a dead zone, and this is another place I'm sure the locals are perfectly fine with that. They don't want any big industries coming there because that'll just bring too many people. Now, a handful of years back, they had a big boom in oil in North Dakota, and that brought in a lot of people, and it sort of screwed up the local economies because the oil boom kind of ended, and a lot of these cities had built up, and then a bunch of people left and a bunch of money left too. And it's kind of weird because it's the same emptiness on the other side of the border in Canada. The lowest city they have in this area is Winnipeg, and that's still a good distance north of the border. There's no change coming to this area, so it's going to stay a dead region for some time, I am sure. And in this case, like I'd said, it's not a bad thing. All right, before we get to number one, the new year is almost among us, and we will start back with our other two channels, The Sweet Life for Briggs, which that starts in January, and we'll be bringing back on this day. There are links for both of those down below. All right, on to the last one. The Lower Great Lake region. Now, have you ever looked at a map and seen the Great Lakes? If you look at the southern end of all those Great Lakes, you'll realize there's some pretty horrible cities there. And it is just a very distressed, run-down part of our country. It starts off with Milwaukee. Milwaukee is on Lake Michigan and it's north of Chicago. Milwaukee is the only negative place to live, I would say, in Wisconsin. You have some other places that have a little bit of crime, but for the most part, every single place in Wisconsin is a decent place to live, at least. You go down to Chicago, Chicago's suckage is legendary, especially the South Side. Then when you get to the South Side, you go right over the border into Indiana, and what's the first city you come to? Gary, Indiana. Gary, Indiana used to be a steel company. It was big manufacturing and shipping steel. These days, it's got a new kind of steel. It's stealing and shooting and poverty. Now, even though it's not on one of the Great Lakes, it's still a little inland. You have South Bend, Indiana. That place is not a great place these days. The only real positive about South Bend is Notre Dame. You keep going east and you run into Toledo on Lake Erie. Toledo's been going downhill since the end of World War II. They've had a couple little sparks of maybe things are going to get better, but it never really gets good enough, or it never makes enough progress to make the city a real option. I do know some people that have lived there in their life. They grew up there. They seem to think there's a lot going on there. There has been some promise, like I said, in the past, but not enough to make it worth it. Now, even though it's off Lake Erie a little bit, up the Detroit River, you have the gem of the Midwest, Detroit. I'm sorry, it's still a piece of coal. Also on Lake Erie, you have Cleveland. Yeah, another gem. You go a little past Cleveland and you run into Erie, Pennsylvania. We just talked about Erie, Pennsylvania recently. It's not doing great. It's actually not a very nice place to live. It does have really cheap real estate, so that's a plus. And then to finish off our tour of the mistakes on the lakes, you have Buffalo, New York. Actually, that's what they call Cleveland and their sports teams like the Browns and everyone, the mistake on the lake. But it kind of suits all these cities along the southern part of the Great Lakes. You know, there's something definitely wrong with a part of the country when all the major cities in that area are just freaking horrible. Buffalo, Cleveland, Toledo, Detroit, South Bend, Chicago, and Gary, Indiana, along with Milwaukee. The only real semi-decent cities in this area were maybe Grand Rapids and Fort Wayne. They're not perfect. Well, Madison's pretty good too up west of Milwaukee, but there's a lot of suckage in this part of the region. That's why it's a dead zone. Nothing's going to change up here again in our lifetime. Unless for some reason we just decide we're done with China completely and bring manufacturing back to the United States, like 100% of it, that'll change these cities overnight almost. Well, course of a few years, but as long as they've sucked, it would seem like overnight. All right, that's the dead regions of America. I hope you guys enjoyed it. Hope you got some information out of it. Everybody have a great day. Be nice to each other.